Good afternoon. Welcome. It's Miss Fenton again from Stevenson High School in Lincolnshire, Illinois. So together today and Dr. Swope, Dr. Swope and I are taking you through the rest of the curriculum. Today we're going to finish up with Unit 2, the biological basis of behavior. So again, here's our overview. This is the 9 units of the course, and we will be focusing on units 1 through 7 because those are the ones that are going to be on this year's exam. So today, again, like I said, we're going to finish up the biological basis of behavior. We're going to go over that FRQ. We're going to talk about neuroplasticity. We're going to delve into states of consciousness, which is part of the bio unit. You may have had a separate standalone unit, or you have a separate standalone chapter in your textbook on states of consciousness, but that's what we're going to focus on today. It's definitely all connected to the biological basis of behavior, brain and neurotransmission stuff we've been talking about for the last few days. So our warm-up, as always, is yesterday's FRQ. And I'll give you a moment to read in case you have not seen this yet. Okay, so this is a combination, it's a mostly research question, but there's a little bit of concept application in here too. But this is what I mean. If you have a 15-minute window to answer your question, I'm not exactly sure how many points will be on it, but you still have to factor in reading the prompt itself, reading the questions that you're going to have to apply, and figuring out, how to answer them. So it's really important that you study and you prepare for this online AP exam no differently than it was a regular AP exam, where you wouldn't have access to supports. Okay, so the first point is asking you to identify the research method. So the research method in this case is a case study, which is a type of descriptive research. So it's important that you identify case study as what's happening here. And this is, if you want to be more specific, it's an individual case study. It's about one particular patient. This is not naturalistic observation. Naturalistic observation would be researchers watching but not interfering with participants as they went about life in the real world, and that's not what happened in this case. This is definitely an in-depth study, and then you have to say why. Why was it used? Which is going back to what Dr. Swope talked to you about with the advantages of a case study. So why they use this? Well, because this is a really rare behavior, and you can't do a survey of people who've had this happen to them because thankfully, there aren't that many. So you can't do an experiment because that would be unethical to randomly assign people to have damage to their hippocampus. So they did this in-depth study because they was able to do something to find out about something that was unique or rare. And you can't use an experiment because it would be unethical. So now these answers here are obviously not exhaustive. There's other ways you could have answered this prompt potentially, and they would have all reflected on advantages of the case study method. So maybe your response was a little bit more related to one of these options. So that was the first point. The second point asked you to identify an ethical flaw and how this might be corrected. So there's a couple ways you could have gone with this, and it wasn't really obvious in the prompt. So you have to really understand about ethics and research design to be able to answer this question. You can't just guess this. So one potential flaw is that because patient HM couldn't form lasting memories, right? So if you were to explain the study or the research you wanted to do with him, he would understand you in the moment, but then a minute later, he wouldn't even remember having the conversation. So an individual like that couldn't possibly give informed consent. So the researchers have to find a way to do this. And the way they do it, it's actually called consent by proxy. So you're going to need his caregiver, whoever has legal authority, to grant permission. And this works similarly, like if you're going to do research with children, you're going to need a parent or guardian to give consent. You can't really get informed consent from a 5-year-old. I have one more example of a different ethical flaw, and this could have to do with confidentiality. So one of the things about research is that you have to protect the privacy of the participants and the personal details that you release to the public when you publish things in literature. And what they did here is they gave him a pseudonym. They called him Patient HM. Okay, point 3, explain the region of the brain that was likely destroyed. So because he can't make new memories, patient HM likely, and this is actually what did happen, had damage to his hippocampus, which is a limbic system structure that encodes new memories. Now, HM could learn new skills, right? So skills are implicit memories, like procedural memories for how to do something. And one of the interesting things about research with patient HM is they gave him, for example, a puzzle, like a jigsaw puzzle. And they asked him, have you ever seen it before? Maybe it was a puzzle with a scene of like the beach, right? No, never seen it before. And he would put it together. Then they would give it to him the next day, the same puzzle. Have you seen this before? No, because he couldn't encode that explicit memory for having seen the puzzle. And they would do this day after day. And what would happen is he would get faster and faster at putting together the puzzle over time because he's had experience with it. That's that implicit memory. But he still didn't remember having ever seen it before. And that shows you that his cerebellum, which is the place for procedural or how-to memories, was not damaged. Okay, what type of amnesia did patient M have? And now this would have been something from your cognitive unit, so the unit on memory. So maybe you remembered the difference between anterograde and retrograde amnesia. And with anterograde amnesia, or any amnesia, retrograde, the individual can't create new memories in this case. If it's retrograde, then they would have trouble remembering, they would have lost old memories, right? Just as a side note, patient HM did die in 2008, and his real name was released. His surgery, which caused this to happen to him, happened when he was 27, and he would go on to live another 55 years with this very severe amnesia. Okay, so taking a kind of a global look at your FRQ practice, did you space out your answer? Ooh, it says 6 distinct sections. It should say 4. This is a shorter FRQ. Did you answer the points in order? Did you define all aspects or make sure you included that definition in your application? And most importantly, did you apply? The apply is what's scored. So did you have enough support that you fully answered the prompt? Okay, today we're going to cover the last couple of topic areas in Unit 2, the biological basis of behavior, starting with the adaptable brain. And a really amazing ability of your brain is the ability of neuroplasticity or plasticity. And this is the amazing capacity of the human brain to modify itself in response to experience, so learning, or repair itself after damage. I'm going to talk about both of these aspects of neuroplasticity. So first of all, neuroplasticity can involve strengthening through use. So your brain is strengthening neural connections or adding synapses to neural networks. And there's so many examples of this that have been studied. The example that I find really interesting is individuals who learn to read Braille. When you put them in fMRI scans, you're going to see that the sensory cortex area related to the finger that they use to read with increases in complexity and size. Also, individuals who are blind, even people who are born blind, when they're reading Braille, you will see activity in their occipital lobe, where you would expect to see it in the parietal lobe, where you have touch. It will be activity there as well. But it's like the brain, in its plasticity, has decided to use this other area that's kind of suited to things like reading or visual tasks in blind individuals to help them, recruit those cells to help them read Braille. Another really fascinating study is one that involved taxi drivers in London. So to be a taxi driver in London, you have to pass a very elaborate test where you must memorize all of the streets in the entire city of London and all of the intersections. And it often takes years of training. And even then, like less than half of the people who take the test actually pass. So it's really tough. Psychologists were really interested, does this process of learning all of the streets and intersections in London have an impact on the brain? And research shows that the drivers who pass this test have an enlarged, they have enlarged or more synaptic connections in hippocampus regions related to spatial memory. So this process of this intense study literally changed their brain. The other kind of other side of the coin with neuroplasticity is this idea of repair of damage. So with brain damage, neurons that are destroyed, typically they just can't be regenerated. And also, like certain functions are controlled by very specific areas in the brain. So it's localization of function. And what happens is with neuroplasticity is other areas of the brain kind of jump in and take over those tasks, take over the responsibilities of the areas of the brain that had been destroyed. And this process of repair, neuroplasticity and repair of damage it's the most powerful in younger children. And one of the most traumatic examples is this example of a surgery called a hemispherectomy. So this individual, this girl, at 6 years of age, she was having very, very severe seizures that were life-threatening. And the only way and they were all in her right hemisphere. And the only way to treat this was to basically remove surgically the entire right hemisphere. And you can see that in the MRI. And they did not take out, her brainstem on that side either. And this works really well. What happened was after the surgery, her left brain started to take over the functions of the right brain, right? So there was a part of her left brain, her left hemisphere, I should say, her left hemisphere was taking care of moving her left arm. So you can see in the image, she does have a little bit of left side paralysis because her right hemisphere was gone, but her left hemisphere is taking over to help move that left arm as well. Okay, so states of consciousness or different types of awareness, it could be things like sleep, dreams, it could be drug-induced states, meditation. There's a wide range of consciousness, and there's a long history of studying consciousness in the field of psychology, going back even to William James. So if you remember William James, he described consciousness as a stream, that awareness or consciousness is essentially this endless flow of ideas and thoughts that just kind of zigzag in different directions. And I'm going to stop for a second and see if you can remember which early theoretical approach was led by William James. Hopefully you remember that he was a functionalist. And what he said is that psychology in terms of consciousness should study the evolved purposes, like the functions of the components that make up the mind. And that was in contrast to the earlier approach of the structuralist, who said that we should identify the elements or components or structures that make up the mind. There's Sigmund Freud. So Freud also had a theory of consciousness, and he divided the conscious mind into 3 layers, and it's often depicted as an iceberg. And this large portion, the unconscious portion, it would be like the biggest part of the iceberg that's deep, deep below the surface and you can't possibly see. So for Freud, that unconscious was the part of the mind that contains thoughts and wishes, memories, that the individual was not aware of and couldn't bring into awareness even if they wanted to. And Freud thought that this was mostly filled with unacceptable thoughts and wishes. And then his next layer is the preconscious. So this is the part of the iceberg that you can see under the surface of the water, like just immediately under the surface. There's enough sunlight, you can see a little bit down. And this is the part of the mind that contains all of your thoughts, knowledge, memories that you're aware of, but not currently thinking about, right? So what you had for breakfast. All right, if you're thinking about that now, let's move to your conscious part of your mind. So that's the part of the iceberg in this image that's above the surface. It's the part of the mind that's currently active and responsive to stimuli and events in the environment. Freud also had a personality theory. It had 3 parts, and you can kind of see that superimposed on this image. You can see the id, which is essentially entirely unconscious, the superego, which is between the conscious and the preconscious mind, and the same for the ego. Now, in the modern psychological science, they don't talk about unconscious in the way that Freud did. So unconscious would be subliminal processing that's occurring outside of awareness. So it could be physiological processes that the mind controls that you don't have to think about, right? It's sometimes like called the unconscious track, right? That one is the part of your mind that's operating without awareness. And one particular type of altered states of consciousness involves drug-induced states. So we're going to take a little bit of time here to talk about the psychoactive drug categories. So it's kind of some broad categories and obviously many, many examples within each category. So first we're going to talk about depressants. So depressants, what they do is they decrease central nervous system activity. They don't, make you sad. So depressant drugs reduce activity. And there's many kinds, and sometimes opioids are like their own category. So I'm going to focus on them for a little bit. Opioids or opiates are drugs that are either made from the opium poppy plant or a synthetic version. And they're generally used to produce pain reduction, insensitivity to stimuli. And these drugs are physically and psychologically very addictive. They are potentially dangerous, all of these drugs, for overdose reasons, but they also have a purpose, right? So morphine is an important drug for helping people to recover from surgery. Now, heroin, however, on the other hand, does not have medical uses and is strictly a drug of abuse. But all of these opioids, they are agonist drugs. So if you remember, an agonist is a drug that binds to a receptor site, or in some cases, prevents reuptake, but it can cause that other cell to fire. And these drugs work on both dopamine and also in case of the opioids, they work as agonists for endorphins. These other drugs too, so they work on many, many neurotransmitters. So something like alcohol is going to be agonist for dopamine, serotonin, and GABA. And the reason why these drugs are dangerous is because they decrease central nervous system activity. And if you are talking about a depressant overdose, what's happening is that depressant medication is slowing down the respiratory, the breathing system so much that the individual literally stops breathing. So stimulants is a second category, and these are kind of the opposite. They're going to increase central nervous system activity and have kind of opposite effects physiologically. And the symptoms are going to vary, and they're based on the specific drug, right? And some of these are going to have much milder stimulant effects, like caffeine as opposed to methamphetamine. So, but they are all have the common category of increasing central nervous system activity. And another category we have is hallucinogens. So these drugs alter mental and emotional functioning, and they tend to create distorted sensations and perceptions. And I have this same note for each one because the symptoms are going to vary on the specific drug, and they're certainly going to vary based on dosage. But two of the most common ones that you're going to see would be cannabis or marijuana, which the active ingredient is THC. And maybe you've seen hallucinogens, LSD as an example as well. So all of these psychoactive drugs work in the nervous system, and they work either as agonists or antagonists. And for the most part, drugs of abuse are going to be agonists for neurotransmitters like dopamine, endorphins, GABA. Alcohol I have here listed as a GABA agonist, but it also affects dopamine and serotonin. So I'm going to take a little bit of a refresher here with how agonist drugs work. So if it's heroin, right, it's an endorphin agonist. And how heroin's going to work on endorphins is it's actually going to fit right into that receptor site that's designed for endorphins. And it's going to work like that counterfeit key to get the drug or the neuron to fire. With cocaine, it's going to work a little bit differently. It's going to work by blocking reuptake. So on the far left of the screen, you're going to have section A. This is traditional neurotransmitters carrying a message, right? So you have the sending neuron. In this case, it's sending, let's say, dopamine. And those dopamine molecules are in the synapse, and they're going to hit the receptor sites on the postsynaptic cell. And hopefully, maybe the cell fires. Then the next part of the process in part B, what happens is reuptake. So the sending neuron, that's that terminal button from the presynaptic neuron, is going to reabsorb, it's called reuptake, all those excess neurotransmitters in the synapse. And that process is called reuptake. So the reason why cocaine is an agonist is what it's going to do is it's going to bind to those receptor sites, right? Not receptor sites, the reabsorption sites. So in this image, those are the little yellow squares are the cocaine molecules. So once the dopamine is released by the sending cell, instead of being the excess being taken back up into the sending cell, it remains in the synapse to repeatedly fire the cell. And cocaine actually blocks reuptake of dopamine, norepinephrine, and serotonin. And this extra neurotransmitters that remain in the synapse longer kind of overstimulate and continually stimulate the cell. So opiates, like I said, are the other way. So they're also an agonist, but they work, instead of blocking reuptake, they literally cause the next cell to fire. They fit into those receptor sites for endorphins. Antagonist drugs block neurotransmission. And you don't see this as much with drugs of abuse. The kind of best example for AP psychology is an antipsychotic medication. So these individuals who have schizophrenia, they have too much dopamine, and so this is going to reduce that transmission. Antipsychotic medications are not drugs of abuse. You can also look at a drug like Narcan. This is an endorphin antagonist that's used to treat overdose. So this drug counters the effects of an opioid overdose, so something like a morphine or heroin overdose, by blocking the receptor sites and not letting those opiates, not letting that heroin stimulate the cell. So during an overdose, opioids depress the respiratory system, and then this is going to prevent that from happening. Now, when you look at substance-related and addictive disorders, you would have like a substance use disorder followed by one of these terms. So it might be a diagnosis of substance use disorder, cannabis, substance use disorder, opioids, or tobacco. And what happens is each of these 11 classes of drugs, right, are going to be categorized as either a substance use or substance abuse disorder. And then the diagnosis, the severity, is based on the number of symptoms present. So you would have substance use disorder, alcohol, mild, right? That individual would have between 2 to 3 symptoms. Severe, 6 or more. And what those symptoms are is there's 4 different categories. And so they fall under these areas of like diminished control, right? So the individual is trying to cut back, but then they can't, right? They're spending a lot of time consumed with craving or activities involved in gaining the substance, like kind of preoccupation with use. This diminished social functioning. We talked in the session about clinical psychology that mental illnesses have to be dysfunctional and distressing to the person. So it's preventing them from holding down a job, going to school, having social interactions that are normal for their life. They're continuing to use potentially, even though it's hazardous, it's dangerous. You know, they're driving under the influence. And then drug action or kind of pharmaceutical qualities would be either tolerance. So the individual has developed a tolerance where they need more and more or stronger doses of the drug in order to experience the same high, or withdrawal. When they attempt to reduce or stop use, they experience physical withdrawal. And those substance-induced disorders, these are just kind of the 2 specific examples under that category. Okay, this is just a summary of kind of the main drugs of abuse, their effects, pleasurable effects, potentially the reason why people abuse them, and then the negative effects as well. Okay, so now I'm going to give you some check for understandings that are going to ask you to incorporate what you understand about the brain and the nervous system in conjunction with what we've just been talking about with psychoactive drugs. So take a few moments and take a look at these 3 examples. Okay. So these are some pretty tough questions. And there's some terms in here we haven't talked about. Like we haven't talked about anandamide, but you should still be able to answer the question. So what category of drug is THC? Yes, it's also a hallucinogen. So if that's the first thing that popped into your mind, that would also be a category. But because it mimics a neurotransmitter, that makes it an agonist drug. Now, ecstasy can lead to these experiences of strong emotions like fear and anxiety, may disrupt memory. That's referencing potentially the limbic system. So if you remember that the amygdala, part of the limbic system, is responsible for strong emotions like anger and fear. And that memory encoding is in the hippocampus, which is also part of the limbic system. And the bottom one asks you about methamphetamine and regulating internal temperature. And that's another piece of the limbic system, that's the hypothalamus. Okay, so let's consider what affects on behavior. If you think about a drug like alcohol, and alcohol is a psychoactive drug, it's capable of crossing the blood-brain barrier. So think about the kind of drug alcohol is. Imagine it crossing the blood-brain barrier, affecting these structures specifically. Consider what you know about what these structures do. What would be the likely behaviors, right, or mental processes that would result? Okay, so with cerebellum, alcohol, first of all, alcohol is a depressant, so it's going to slow down central nervous system activity. So if alcohol crosses the blood-brain barrier and it slows down or depresses the cerebellum, the observable behavior might be a lack of balance and coordination. You might see someone potentially stumble or fall. If you think about the hippocampus encodes new memories. So if the hippocampus is depressed by a drug like alcohol, then that individual, when they experience things like those memories might not actually be encoded. They might not be sent to the frontal lobe for storage. And that might explain, blackouts. If you look at something like the medulla, now this is getting very serious. So the medulla regulates heart rate and breathing. And so heart rate and breathing would be slowed from alcohol, but if there was enough alcohol to depress the central nervous system activity, that person's heart or breathing could stop, right? So extremely dangerous, and this is the way you would see how an overdose would work with a depressant medication. And finally, we have the prefrontal cortex. So this is the part of the brain that helps people to plan, reason, make good decisions. So if this area is depressed, maybe individuals who are under the influence don't make good decisions. Maybe they think that they can drive. If you ask them when they were not under the influence, they would say, no, I would never drive while drunk. And so this depressed, impaired judgment area can have really scary consequences. So we did this as an example with alcohol, which is a depressant. Now, imagine if you had a stimulant drug. So maybe a strong stimulant like cocaine. How might that drug affect these brain areas or maybe other brain areas? So that's something for you to think about. And you could also think about the risk of overdose and how this happens. Okay, sleeping and dreaming. So biological rhythms. There's circadian rhythms. There's also another type of biological rhythm, like your 90-minute sleep cycle. But your circadian rhythms are your biological clock. And the way this works physiologically is light from the outside is going to hit your retina, and it's going to send this information to the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which is my personal favorite brain part. And these are cell clusters actually in the hypothalamus. And that's going to send a signal to the pineal gland, right? If it's light out, to stop melatonin production. So that hormone that's going to make you sleepier. When it's nighttime, then the pineal gland is going to be signaled to start producing and releasing more melatonin. And this all works on a 24-hour cycle. Another example of a biological rhythm is the sleep cycle. So it's this repeating 90-minute pattern of non-REM and REM stages that occurs multiple times during the night. So you have the three stages, stages 1, 2, and 3, which are non-REM and REM. Now, if you have an older textbook, you might see in your textbook images where you have stage 4, 1, 2, 3, and 4. Apparently, science got together, they took a vote, and they decided that 3 and 4 were essentially the same. I'm kidding, but 1, 2, and 3, if you are seeing in your textbook 4, consider 3 and 4 kind of the same. REM is sometimes called paradoxical sleep, and that's because during this sleep stage, you have EEG activity, so brainwave activity that is similar to an awake state. It's not exactly. So when you're awake and alert, you have predominantly beta waves, and REM waves are beta, I guess, like in appearance. So, and whereas you're sleeping and you're dreaming and you have this almost similar to an awake state brain activity, you also have an active motor cortex, but the brainstem is blocking those messages. And as a result, like the major muscles are just really relaxed. Okay, so these are just kind of the different brainwave activities measured by an EEG. So again, I said the beta waves, waking beta waves, are awake and alert. Alpha waves are going to be dominant when you're awake but relaxed. They're often dominant during things like meditation. Theta waves, the slow, regular waves of light sleep, and then delta with the D for deep sleep. And then in REM, you have those beta-like waves. As I mentioned, there's like a 90-minute repeating sleep cycle. And you start out in the awake, and then you're going to go to stage 1, 2, 3, then back up again to 2, then to REM, to REM. So if you notice, you're only in stage 1 one time. So, and the REM cycles are going to be between the two stage 2s, if that makes sense. During stage 1, it's a really light stage, and they call it a hypnagogic stage. You might have hypnagogic sensations where you, as you're falling asleep, you experience hallucinations or maybe the sensation that you're falling. And sometimes you even have like a sudden muscular jerk, and that might even wake you up. So stage 1 is very light. Stage 2 is characterized by something called sleep spindles, and these are unique brainwave patterns that represent short, rapid bursts of brainwave activity with increased frequency, and sometimes even K complexes, which are like a single extremely high spike in amplitude. Stage 3 is where most dreams occur. So this is that deep sleep, those delta waves. This is also stage 3 where sleepwalking and sleep talking would likely occur. And then REM, again, we talked about this earlier, is rapid eye movements, your blood pressure, heart rate, and breathing increase, and you have this sense of like muscle relaxation or loss of muscle tone during this time period. And you have the brainwave pattern in REM that's similar to an awake state. Another interesting concept is that sleep studies have shown that the REM really does matter. So if you look at the sleep cycle of a young adult, right, you're going to see that as you go deeper and deeper into the night, right, as you're getting more and more hours of sleep, what's going to happen is there's less deep sleep, less stage 3, and more REM as the night progresses. Now, if you were to only receive 4 hours of sleep, then you wouldn't have all of the REM that you are supposed to have. And there's a phenomenon called REM rebound. So it's this tendency for REM sleep to increase if you're following a night where you had REM deprivation, right? Either created by repeated awakenings or not getting enough full sleep cycles. So your body does need both REM and deep sleep. When you think about, theories for the purpose of sleep, you kind of have some 4 kind of broad categories. The first couple, they're seen as maybe evolutionary theories. So sleep evolved as a way to help early humans be safe and conserve energy. Humans don't have very good night vision, so maybe it would be best for them to not wander around. Recovery, maybe sleep was naturally selected because it allows for this period where the body can repair itself and restore depleted resources, recuperate from physical or an emotional strain, and repair damaged neurons. A lot of research supports this idea that sleep is needed for memory consolidation, right? So it's important for learning. And growth hormone is released by the pituitary gland during sleep. So sleep is also related to growth and development. That brings us to dream theories. And if you look at these, you can kind of see them in the context of the perspectives or approaches to psychology. So you have Freud's psychoanalytic theory for dreams, which lacks scientific support. And he talks about dreams in terms of the latent and the manifest content. Information processing and cognitive development, those are both kind of cognitive theories, how they help with memory. And activation synthesis is a key theory of the biological basis for dreams. Another category of disorders are sleep-wake disorders. And what's important here is that regardless of the sleep-wake disorder, if an individual has serious disruption in sleep, there's a lot of negative consequences that result from that. So sleep-wake disorders, which are also treatable, untreated can cause a lot of risk factors. This is just a quick overview of the sleep-wake disorders. So you have insomnia is probably the most prevalent. And when you hear the word prevalence, that's how widespread or common a condition is. And some sleep disorders are rare and others are more common. So in this diagram, it's referred to as rate, but it's the same as saying prevalence, like how prevalent is this condition in the population. And remember, these have to cause significant distress and dysfunction. Occasional insomnia is not a disorder, and it's normal. It's just maybe you're excited about something or nervous. It's when it becomes distressing and dysfunctional and kind of more long-term potentially. All right, so we didn't go into detail, but let's see what you can remember about sleep-wake disorders from earlier in the year. See how you do with these, check for understandings. Okay, so example number one is narcolepsy. So narcolepsy, individuals do experience potentially this concept of cataplexy and sudden loss of muscle tone while awake that coincides with these like sleep attacks, which are hallmarks of narcolepsy. The highest prevalence or the most common is insomnia, and that's persistent inability to either fall asleep or stay asleep. With three, another example of narcolepsy. So the gene for narcolepsy is seems to be related to differences in this protein. And which of the following would be most likely be treated with a CPAP machine? So I just want to show you an example of what a CPAP machine looks like. And how this device works is it applies mild air pressure and it allows the airwaves to remain open during sleep, leading to better sleep. It's very effective. And it's also, however, sometimes difficult for people to feel comfortable and be able to sleep with this machine. But um, sleep apnea is very serious and can have a lot of negative health effects. So it's important to make sure it's treated. Okay, so we covered a lot pretty fast today, including category of disorders, a couple of them, sleep-wake disorders, and also substance use disorders. So even though Unit 8, clinical psychology, is not on the exam, these disorders are part of this unit. So it's important that you are aware of these as well. Okay, I'm going to leave you with a practice FRQ that Dr. Swope will be going over with you first thing tomorrow when we start up again. So take a look at this. It'll help you to kind of synthesize both today and yesterday when we talked about brain scans. So how does an EEG work in the context of states of consciousness and sleep research? Okay, thanks for watching, and I will see you in a few days, and you will be back here tomorrow with Dr. Swope. Bye-bye.